All right. Well,
But I really appreciate your instruction.
oh, thank you. I hope so, but I'm glad. I'm glad if you do. Um, yeah, I mean, we all learn in different ways. We all, absorb and take in information in different ways. Uh, but I personally find in person with interactions the most memorable for me. I remember those things better than when I just read them. And also, of course, this is a chance to ask questions in person, and it's always, I think it's easier to ask and also to answer questions um, this way rather than in writing. But this is our situation, right? So last time we, I think we ended on bracketing, and then talked about, we went into looking at Lightroom. So I want to move on with our technical information, the classroom technical camera stuff, and then go back into Lightroom as well. So bracketing, we said, is something that we do to ensure that our image will be properly exposed. So our light meters function in our cameras to tell our cameras how much light to let into the camera. And generally we believe them and trust them, but there are certain situations in which a light meter can be fooled. Lighting situations that are extreme. So if you have deep shadows and bright highlights, the light meter can only really latch on to one thing and expose for that. It can't expose correctly both for deep shadows and bright highlights and the in-between stuff. So we said bracketing, which is making 3 different images at different exposures of the same thing, is something that we can do to help ensure that we have an image that's properly exposed. So the hope is that one of those 3 images, the normal or the overexposed or the underexposed, one of them will be correct. Okay. So any questions on bracketing? Anybody? All good? Okay. Um,
Duke is the best.
what's that? Sorry? Nothing?
Sorry, I thought my mute was on.
Oh,
Oh, sorry.
no worries. No worries. Just checking to see if you had a question. Okay, so today I want to talk about something called depth of field. Now, I believe we have not touched on that really yet. Does that sound correct to you guys? Anybody? Anybody?
Yeah, that sounds correct.
Good. Okay, good. um, so let me just get us to this screen. So when we talked about equivalent exposures, and I've got an example up here, not the same numbers I gave you when we talked about equivalent exposures, because those are just possibilities, and here are some more possible combinations. But when we talked about equivalent exposures, we talked about changing the shutter speed, purposely changing it, and we said that was because of to photograph motion. We said that if we wanted to stop or freeze motion, we would use a fast shutter speed. So, for example, a 500th of a second. And if we wanted to show motion as a blur, we would use a slow shutter speed, for example, 1/8 of a second. And of course, when we change the shutter speed and change the amount of light entering the camera, we have to compensate for that by changing the size of the aperture. So the faster the shutter speed we use, the larger the aperture. Since fast shutter speeds let in less light, we have to let more light in through the aperture. For slow shutter speeds, we let lots of light in when the shutter remains open for a longer period of time, so we compensate for that by using a small aperture that lets in less light. So again, we talked about this in terms of speed of the, in terms of shutter speed and why we would want to adjust that. And so today I want to talk about why we would want to adjust the size of the aperture. And that is so that we can control something called depth of field. And that is depth of field. And the depth of field is the area or the amount of space in your image, in the frame, from the foreground to the background, or from the foreground to the background, that is in focus. How much of that space is sharp? And so you've seen images, I'm sure, where just one area is sharp. So often in portraiture, just the subject is sharp, and then everything behind and maybe in front is blurry. And that's called shallow depth of field. The opposite of that is called great depth of field, where most or all of the frame from the foreground to the background is sharp, is in focus. Many portrait photographers tend to use shallow depth of field to isolate the subject from other information that might compete with them or be distracting. Many landscape photographers use great depth of field where everything's in focus, so that you have this sense of the landscape, of everything. Those are not hard and fast rules. Not all portrait photographers use shallow depth of field, and not all landscape photographers use great depth of field. But anyway, that's what we're going to talk about today. And there are three things that control or affect how much of the frame is in focus. And the first of those things is the aperture, the size of the aperture. And that's what we as photographers tend to use when we purposely want to change the depth of field, how much of the frame is in focus. So let me just bring up something here. Sorry, my connection is just horrifically slow. And I apologize for that, but can't really do much about it, I'm afraid. I'm looking for something here, sorry. Very slow, sorry. Consonants. Good. Okay, sorry. Back over to this. And apologies. Okay. I don't know what the problem is here. Any questions or comments while I'm looking for stuff here? Sorry about this. Yeah, I don't know why this is so problematic, but apparently it is. Okay, I think I finally almost gotten this going. It's not actually loading the images. Come on. Wow. Okay, this is a problem. So sorry. Bizarre. No images are coming up. Well, all right, let me try this a different way. Oh, man. I'm so sorry. Okay, well, this will hopefully. Okay. Better than nothing. Okay. Can you see this page here that says depth of field?
Yes.
Okay. So depth of field. Sorry about that. The area in or of the image that is in focus, specifically the area in front of and behind the point of focus that's in focus. So if you focus on my nose, there's always a certain amount of space in front of and behind that point that's also in focus. And that can be a tiny amount of space, which is shallow depth of field, or a huge amount of space, huge, and that's great depth of field. The ratio of that space from in front of the point to behind the point is always the same, however. So of the total amount of space that's in focus, 1/3 is in front of the point of focus and 2/3 behind. So if there is a total of 3 feet in focus, there are, then one of those feet will be in front of my nose and 2 feet behind. And so that's a ratio of 1 to 2, or 1/3 in front to 2/3 behind. And you can have a huge amount of space, 150 feet in focus, 50 of those feet would be in front and 100 behind, or I'm doing obviously multiples of 3 here. 15 feet, if you have a total of 15 feet, 5 feet would be in front and 10 behind, and so on. So we said that depth of field is affected by 3 things. And again, the first thing is the size of the aperture. And so when we want to purposely change how much of the frame is in focus, generally we'll change the size of the aperture, and then of course have to compensate for that change by changing the shutter speed as well. The rule is the smaller the aperture, and that is the larger the f-stop number, so for example f22, the greater the depth of field. The more will be in focus in front of and behind your point of focus. The larger the aperture, and that is the smaller the f-stop number, for example f2, the shallower the depth of field will be. The less will be in focus. So the point of focus will still be in focus, but you'll have less space in front of and behind the point of focus that is also sharp. So again, great depth of field is when most or all of the frame from the foreground to the background is in focus. And shallow depth of field is when very little of the frame, aside from the point of focus or the subject, is in focus. Why is that? And this is not something you have to memorize, but just a little overview. So when you focus on a subject, what you're focusing on is the light that's reflected from that subject. And unless that subject is in a completely darkened space with only the subject illuminated, light from other areas will also enter the camera. You know, house behind, a flower in front, or whatever's in the scene. And so many of those things are at different distances from the camera than the subject. And so their points of focus are at different distances than the point of focus of the subject. So the light from the subject enters the camera through the lens, and it's focused at a point in the lens that we said is called the nodal point, the optical center of the lens. But the light from these other areas in front of the point of focus and behind are at different distances and do not necessarily focus at the nodal point. And these areas, these other points of focus, are called circles of confusion, which I think is a great name. Because they're not focusing at the same distance, they will appear out of focus. But as you close the aperture down, as it gets smaller and smaller, you bundle the light. The light is forced to go through this smaller and smaller hole, this aperture. And as that happens, these circles of confusion, these other points of focus, are forced to move closer and closer to the nodal point, to the point of focus. They never actually reach it, but they appear to. And so with a very small aperture, since all of these other points of focus have moved close to the actual point of focus, they all appear to be sharp. And so the depth of field is great, where everything appears to be in focus. As you open up the aperture again, those points separate back and will then again appear to be out of focus. Okay. Same thing. The second thing that affects depth of field is the focal length of the lens, how long the lens is. So we talked about the three categories of lenses: normal, wide angle, and telephoto. And the general rule is the shorter the lens, that is the wider the angle of view, the greater the depth of field, the more will be in focus. And the longer the lens, the more telephoto, the shallower the depth of field. And that is because although all lenses have certain certain f-stop numbers in common. So almost all lenses have, for example, f8 or f11. The actual size of that aperture is not the same from lens to lens. It's dependent on the focal length. And so f8 on a 24 millimeter lens, for example, a wide angle lens, is not the same as f8 on an 80 millimeter lens, which is a telephoto lens, even though the number is the same. So you don't have to memorize this, but the diameter of the aperture, which is described in millimeters, is equal to the focal length of that lens divided by the f-stop number. And so if we take the 24 millimeter lens, the short lens, and divide it by the f-stop number 8, we get 3 millimeters. And so that's the diameter of f8 on the 24 millimeter lens when it's set to f8. sorry, so it's the diameter of the aperture when the aperture is set to f8 on the 24 millimeter lens. With the 80 millimeter lens, also set at f8, we divide 80 by 8 and we get 10 millimeters, which is it's more than 3 times the size of f8 on the 24 millimeter lens. And we said that the smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. And so since f8 on the short lens is much smaller than f8 is on the long lens, we will have greater depth of field on the short lens because f8 is actually a lot smaller, giving us greater depth of field on the short lens than f8 is on the 80 millimeter lens. So, but the general rule is the shorter or more wide angle the lens, the greater the depth of field, and the longer or the more telephoto the lens, the shallower the depth of field. Any questions? Anybody? Okay. And finally, the third thing that affects depth of field is the distance from the subject or from the point of focus. So the further away you are from your point of focus, so if you're like 15 feet away from me and my nose, the greater the depth of field. And the closer you are, so if you come in closer to maybe 2 feet from me, the depth of field will be shallower. So the further you are away from your subject or point of focus, the greater the depth of field, and the closer you are to the subject, the shallower the depth of field, or the less will be in focus. That has to do with the angle of the light as it enters the camera. So you may have noticed that your lenses will not allow you to come in beyond a certain point. If you come in too close to your subject, the lens just won't focus. And the longer the lens, the further back you have to be. And that has to do with the angle of the light entering the camera. So when you're close, this angle is really big. And the lens has difficulty handling large angles of this sort. So you can think of it as it's all the lens can do to focus on the point of focus, and it really cannot have much else in focus. Even if you use a small aperture and a short lens, which will normally give you great depth of field, when you come in very close to your subject, the depth of field will be shallow. But as you back up and that angle of light gets smaller, the lens can handle that better, and so more and more will be in focus. The depth of field will be greater. Okay. So again, 3 things that affect depth of field: the size of the aperture, the focal length of the lens, and the distance from the point of focus, or the subject. So with the aperture, a small aperture will give you great depth of field. A large aperture will give you shallow depth of field. With the focal length of the lens, a short or wide angle lens will give you great depth of field. A longer or telephoto or more telephoto lens will give you shallower depth of field. And with the distance from the point of focus or the subject, the further you are from the subject or point of focus, the greater the depth of field, and the closer you are to the point of focus, the shallower the depth of field. Any questions on that? Anybody? All good? Okay, so I'd like to look at some examples of this. So let me just get out of that and go to this. So can you see that this says depth of field? Anybody?
No.
No. Okay, thank you. Right. Okay. How's that? Can you guys see that?
Depth of field examples.
Yeah.
That's what I see.
Okay, cool. Excellent. All right, so let me just go over, since they are here, a couple of things. We've talked about this, but the effect of changing the focal length of the lens on how much information you can see. So I like this example because it gives these cones showing what happens to the angle of view as you extend the lens out or as you use a longer lens. So in this first example here at 11 millimeters, we have this scene with the lake in the foreground, a hill, and in the very far distance, a castle at the other side of the lake. And as the focal length is extended, as it gets longer, we come in closer and closer. So in effect, cropping, but doing it with the lens. So at 35 millimeters, we still see the lake and some of the hill, but less of it, and the castle appears closer and closer still at 55, and now at 125 millimeters. We can no longer see the lake. We just see the castle and the hills beyond it. At 200 millimeters, more of the castle, less of the foreground. And finally at 400 millimeters, just the top of the castle. So with the extreme telephoto lens, the 400 millimeters, we can see this piece of information in the center or close to the center of the frame that with the wide angle lens, 11 millimeters, we can hardly see at all. All right. The effect of changing the ISO, this example starts at ISO 1600. Most of our cameras go down to 100 or 200. But even at 1600, and I don't know which camera was used to make these examples, I apologize. But even at 1600, you can see the sharpness still. You can make out the numbers on this measuring tape. You can read the text in the foreground. But as the ISO increases from there, you can definitely see a degradation in the quality of the image, both in terms of sharpness and also in terms of seeing these blobs of color that are called artifacts that weren't there before. So we're seeing these blobs of purple and some green that just don't belong there, and a gritty or graininess that we didn't see earlier. The numbers are not as sharp. The text is not as sharp, and as we go across 6400 and then finally to 12800, you can no longer read the numbers at all. On the measuring tape, you can't really read the text. There are all these blobs and little gritty things, so you can definitely see the degradation of the image. At this point. Excuse me. Newer and higher end cameras look much, much better at the higher ISO ratings than this. So my camera, this is a Nikon D7100. It's a little older now. Really starts to show noise. These artifacts and things from about ISO 400 and up. So it really doesn't handle the higher ratings that well. Many other cameras, even I think the newer Nikons of the same line, do much better. Okay. So depth of field. This image shows us shallow depth of field, and that is where pretty much only the point of focus is in focus. And so it's a little different than the images we expect to see. We usually expect to see the area that takes up the majority of the frame, in this case the foreground, to be sharp. But the photographer chose to focus on the midground here at point B rather than A. So this is shallow depth of field. It says the aperture setting is at f2, which is a large aperture. And most of our zoom lenses don't open up that far. So we have really pretty shallow depth of field. This image shows great depth of field. So the aperture was stopped down to f16, which is a difference of 6 stops. And you can see a huge change in the depth of field and what's in focus. So the point of focus remains the same, point B, but now the boy in the foreground and the man in the background are sharp. And that's because of the use of the small aperture. So you can see that the distance from the subject didn't change. We can tell that the focal length didn't change because the framing is the same. So the only thing that changed is the size of the aperture. So here, this diagram shows us what's going on from the side. And so we have the photographer, the boy in the foreground, the boy in the midground, and the man in the background. And this lens is, this shows us something called a depth of field preview, which new lenses don't do, and I think that's really too bad, because it shows us what will be in focus depending on the f-stop we've got set. So the focusing ring is out here, and it gives the distance from the subject in feet. Many give in feet and in meters. And then the f-stop setting with the center hatch mark showing us what it's, the original setting. And then here is the aperture ring at the bottom, and it's set to f2 right now, and you can stop it down. This lens stops down to f16. But this area in the middle shows us what will be in focus as we stop down the aperture. So at f2, if you look at the focusing ring, something from about 7 or 6.5 to 7.5 feet will be in focus. And it says here, depth of field is 1 foot. So 1 foot of space going back in the frame is in focus. And you can see on the lens here, as you extend, as you close down the aperture, go to the larger f-stop numbers, the amount of space that's in focus will expand. And so here, with the maximum depth of field, with the aperture stopped down to f16, now everything from just ahead of 5 feet, so maybe 4 3/4 feet, back to maybe 12 feet, 12.5 feet, is in focus. So from just in front of the boy in the foreground to the man in the background. And it says here the depth of field is 8 feet. So that's why we're seeing this change, this great change in the depth of field. Okay. So using the aperture and the shutter together, and the effect of change, and of course you have to use them together, that you have to move them together. So in this example, a slow shutter speed, 1/8 of a second, is being used. And because they're letting a lot of light in through the shutter, a smaller aperture is used, f16. And so because the small aperture is used, you have great depth of field. So everything from the foreground to the background is sharp. But because a slow shutter speed is being used, the motion of whatever's in the foreground is totally blurry. And it tells us here they're birds, very blurry bird wings. But we wouldn't necessarily know that if we weren't told that. We wouldn't necessarily know these are birds. We can just see that there's something moving. Now the shutter speed has been changed to 1/125th of a second, so it's gone to a much faster shutter speed. And to compensate for that, the aperture has opened up from f16 to f4, and that's about 4 stops. And so the depth of field is now shallower. It's not incredibly shallow. We can still see what's going on from the foreground to the background, but the background is less sharp than it is here. The motion of the birds, however, is frozen a lot more. So at 1/125th of a second, there's still motion, but many of the birds who are either, who are not moving quickly are frozen. The wings of the birds that are moving, that are flapping the wings, that motion is faster than this shutter speed can stop, can freeze. So that's blurry. And then finally, at a 500th of a second, a much faster shutter speed, 2 stops faster than 1/125th, the motion of the birds is almost completely stopped. There's a tiny bit of blur over here and maybe here where the wings are still moving faster than the shutter speed can freeze. But overall, the motion is stopped or frozen at a 500th of a second. To compensate for using such a fast shutter speed, the aperture is now wide open at f2, and you can see what's happened to the depth of field now. Only the foreground is in focus. The background is completely blurry. Not that you can't tell what it is. The forms are distinct enough and far away enough that we can still make them out, but they're completely out of focus. So again, as you change the size of the aperture, the depth of field changes. You have to compensate for that by changing the shutter speed. And so if there's something moving in the frame, that effect will be changed. Right? When you come in very close to your subject, the depth of field will be shallow, regardless. So even if you use a small aperture and a short lens, when you come in very close to your subject, the background will still, or the depth of field will still be shallow. It won't be nearly as shallow as when you use a large aperture and a longer lens, but it will still be shallow. So if you look at the image, the part of the image on the left, a small aperture f32, which is pretty small, was used, which normally would give us very great depth of field. But since we're in close, the depth of field is shallow. So the flower that is the point of focus here is in focus. The flower just below it and a little bit behind is also in focus. But by the time we get to the background, it's pretty out of focus. Not so out of focus that we can't tell what's going on. We still see, we have a sense of other flowers, of the foliage, of the ground here, but it is out of focus. On the right, the depth of field is incredibly shallow. So a large aperture was used, f5, and now when we leave the point of focus, the flower in the middle, the flower just behind it is already soft in focus. And behind that, maybe a few inches, the depth of field is so shallow that this flower is totally blurry, and the background is so out of focus that we don't know what it is. Having seen the other side, we can make an assumption that it's the same, more of the same. But just looking at this side, we just have an impression of colors and areas of lighter and darker tones, but we can't make out really what it is at all. So again, when you come in very close to your subject, the depth of field will be shallow, regardless, almost always. More examples of that. And then I want us to look at some examples of works, of photographs made by established well-known photographers. So this image and the next one, this one was made by a photographer, an American photographer named Ansel Adams. And Ansel Adams was one of the very well-known photographers of the 20th century. He was instrumental in making photography more accepted as an art form rather than something more scientific or technical. Now, what happened there? Sorry. When people think of black and white images, many of them think of the sorts of images that Adams made. Landscapes. Adams worked primarily in the western United States and southwestern United States, in Yosemite and in the Sierra Nevada. So his images were imposing, with bright whites and dark shadows, but a beautiful tonal range of grays in between. For any of you who have studied black and white photography, darkroom photography, maybe you've heard of something called the zone system, which was devised by Adams as a way of controlling the black and white process from beginning to end. So Adams did something that he called pre-visualization, and that is, he said that when he saw a scene, he saw in his mind's eye the finished print and the way he wanted it to look. And so the system he devised was a way of controlling the process from shooting the image to developing the film to printing in the darkroom in order to achieve this print that he had pre-visualized. Now, we don't all photograph that way. We don't all see this finished image in our mind's eye as soon as, we see a scene. Another photographer, an American photographer named Gary Winogrand, said that, I photograph to see what things look like as photographs. And so that's the complete opposite of pre-visualization. That's, he is implying, though I'm sure he had some idea, but implying that he really didn't know what it would end up looking like until he saw the negative and printed it out. So no one way is correct. We all have our own methods and philosophies of shooting. Adams was a founding member of a group that called itself the F64 group. Now, this wasn't a huge thing, but members of this group, including some other well-known photographers, felt that photographers should use great depth of field, that they shouldn't use shallow depth of field, that it was, and I'm putting words in their mouths maybe, but that it was almost cheating to use shallow depth of field to direct the viewer's eyes into the frame, that it was too easy in a way, that photographers should use composition. They should use elements, of form and line and light and dark to move the viewer's eyes into and around the frame. And f/64 is a very small aperture that you find on medium and especially large format cameras, which is what Adams used. And that gives you very, very great depth of field. So you can see in this image, which is an image of Mount Williamson photographed from the eastern Sierra, so from Manzanar looking west, everything is in focus. The depth of field is very great. And Adams used form, so the triangle or the pyramid to lead us into the frame and back into the frame. He uses light to guide us back into the frame. And then we have, again, these beautiful pyramids here with an inverted pyramid in the center with the clouds and the beautiful God light, and finally Mount Williamson in the background with the clouds around it, and everything from the foreground to the background at infinity is sharp, is in focus. So this image shows us very great depth of field. Adams was not known for his portraiture at all, but this image was made by Adams of a man named Orville Cox, and then the American painter Georgia O'Keeffe. Great expression on her face, isn't it? She looks mischievous, as if she's plotting something. Anyway, as I said earlier, many portrait photographers use shallow depth of field to isolate the subjects from whatever may be going on in the background. Adams did not do that here. So everything from the foreground, that is the area closest to the lens, which is like Cox's elbow here, back to infinity, the clouds, everything is in sharp focus. And yet it works nicely as a portrait, as an image of these two people. Adams photographed them from below, so he kind of elevated them in the frame, and he's elevated them into the clouds, so we don't have a sense of where they are or anything else, just that they're almost larger than life and placed into the clouds. So it works very well. This is probably my favorite, I think, example of great depth of field because it's so extreme. And it was made by a photographer named Bill Brandt, who's German-English, and photographed primarily in England from the 1920s into the 60s or 70s. This image was made with a camera that he found in a thrift store. It had belonged to a police department, and it had a fixed aperture, but a very, very, very small aperture. And it, as you can see here, it gave him almost infinite depth of field. So everything from the extreme foreground, this ear, maybe a couple of inches from the lens, all the way back to infinity, the looming ominous cliff and the ominous dark clouds, everything is in sharp focus, and it has a very surreal effect. And Brandt was friends with and definitely influenced by some of the surrealist artists of the time, in particular the Belgian painter René Magritte. And you can, I think, see that effect here with this ear taking up a third of the frame. It's kind of jarring to see. I think it's also impressive how incredibly sharp the lens was, and you can make out the tiny fine hairs on the ear. This image was made by a French photographer named Henri Cartier-Bresson, and it shows great depth of field. It was made in Kashmir in India around 1948, just after India had been partitioned and became the modern state of India and of Pakistan and eventually of Bangladesh as well. It shows these women photographed from behind, looking out over this valley and to the hills on the other side. We don't see them as individuals, really. We can make out this woman's profile, that's it. They're more symbolic in some ways. And this woman has this beautiful gesture of almost of supplication. Cartier-Bresson was not a photographer who stuck with one kind of depth of field. He did vary it, but in this case he used great depth of field. And this shows us what these women are experiencing. Had he used shallow depth of field and isolated the women, the image would have been about them, not as individuals, but as a group, also about their clothing, the beautiful folds and pleats and so on. But with the background out of focus, we wouldn't really have a sense of placement, of context. The great depth of field shows us what they are experiencing, this valley in front of them, the beautiful hills and clouds beyond. So Cartier-Bresson made a conscious choice as to how much of the frame he wanted in focus. And Cartier-Bresson had a philosophy of photography that he called the decisive moment, a moment unlike any other, which could be the height of action, but could also be that moment when all elements came together in a way that worked for him. He believed in composing in the camera. That you should look around the frame, not just at your subject, but what else is going on in the frame, and see if you need it, or maybe you need more. So if you see this, if you look at this black line around the frame, that indicates that this is a full frame print, that it has not been cropped. And that is how Cartier-Bresson always, with one exception that I can think of, that his images were uncropped. And they were almost always printed with this black line around to show that they were not cropped. And not that you have to do this 100%, but it's a good thing to think about. So let's say you're only interested in this area here, the woman's head with her arms held out. And you make this image, and then you decide to crop it down to this. Well, you've gotten rid of maybe 90% of the frame, and you're left with 10%. And when you then use that, though, that becomes larger, but you don't have more information. You're just making the information larger. So with pixels, let's say you had 1 million pixels and you got rid of 900,000 of them and you have 100,000 left. You're just making those bigger. And so the image will be more out of focus. You may actually start to see the pixels of that make up, that are the basis for digital images. In film photography, you start to see the individual grains of silver that make up the image. And generally, that is considered to be pretty undesirable. So if you're only interested in this area, then you come in closer, if possible, and fill your frame with that instead of just dumping information after the fact. And that is if you can. So if you're photographing something, a situation that's happening quickly, or you can't always say, oh, I just want this tiny little area. You you do what you can with the situation you have and the equipment you have. Right. We'll go through those. This is an example of shallow depth of field. It was made by an American photographer named Gordon Parks. It was made in Chicago in 1963. Parks worked primarily for Life magazine, though not entirely, from the 1940s or so into the 1980s. He died, I think, in the early part of the 21st century. And this is a beautiful example of shallow depth of field. We have this woman, Ethel Sharif, in focus, and then this information, these women going back in the frame, falling out of focus. And it's a sort of reverse perspective. So instead of the perspective going back in the frame, it's coming out at us, and it's very effective. It's very powerful. But since we can't see these other women really very well as individuals, it's almost as if Ethel Sharif is repeated over and over and over again, going back in the frame. The frame has this effect of symmetry. It's not symmetrical, but it's very highly organized, and it gives us a sense of symmetry. This is another image by Gordon Parks of the boxer Muhammad Ali as a young man. And it has a beautiful fall off, I think, of the focus. The depth of field is shallow, but subtly so. Notice that the head and the hands are both in focus. And that is because they are both at the same distance from the lens. So Ali is leaning forward, his body recedes, but his hands and his head are at the same distance. So they're both sharp. And whether or not Gordon Parks consciously chose to do this, and he might have, it gives an emphasis on both his hands and his head. And of course, Ali was a boxer. His hands very important. But he's also an intelligent, thoughtful person who wrote poetry. And so by having the head in focus as well, it kind of addresses that aspect of him as well. This image was made by a Swiss photographer named Robert Frank, who came to this country after the Second World War, and received a Guggenheim Foundation fellowship to travel around the country and photograph. And so that was from 1955 to 56, and his work was published in a book called The Americans, which was well received in Europe and poorly received here for a couple of reasons. The first was that it showed America in a way that Americans at the time probably didn't want to see. So it didn't show the post-war America of prosperity and the rise of industry and so on. It didn't show the happy upper middle class family with the 2.5 children. Instead, it tended to look more at the disenfranchised of the country, people of color, blacks, Native Americans, Latinos, the elderly, teenagers, people who were not, for whatever reason, part of mainstream successful society. That said, his work has become a classic. It was like the first photographed road trip, which has been much copied since then. It's kind of the beginnings of grunge photography, where things are not always organized neatly in terms of composition. Horizon lines are often not horizontal, and so many photographers really objected to his work because they considered it sloppy. Again, that said, his work has become a classic and much copied. This image was made in Hollywood, showing the arrival of an actress at a movie premiere, and it shows her in a way that, sorry, I should have turned my phone off. It shows her in a way that we don't expect. Generally, when someone takes up the bulk of the frame, we expect them or expect that subject to be sharp. And so it's kind of jarring to see her out of focus. And we don't like to look at things that are out of focus. Given the option, we choose to look at things or areas that are in focus. And so our eyes are directed back in the frame to the areas that are in focus. And those are the people who are watching the stars, in this case, the star arrive. And we have some great expressions, peering, kind of pensive, admiring, very admiring. So those are the areas we're directed to look at, and those are the people like us, the onlookers. And Robert Frank presents this person, this star. I think it might have been Kim Novak. I could be wrong. Kind of the way we experience famous people, larger than life, and kind of out of focus, not quite real, Okay, let me go through a few more. This image was made by the same photographer, Bill Brandt, who did the ear, but it's totally different in terms of the depth of field. In this case, instead of having incredibly great depth of field, we have incredibly shallow depth of field, where there's so little of the frame in focus that we have no idea really what's going on in the background. So we have the foreground, these forms that are actually the tops of knees. And again, the lens is so sharp that we can see the individual hairs. But in this case, the background is so out of focus that we don't really know what it is. Having seen that other image, we can think, oh, maybe that's that same beach. There are boulders here. But the depth of field is so shallow that the focus falls off almost immediately. And so this could be ocean and sky. It could be a wall. It could be grass. And, who knows? So this becomes more of a study of form, of areas of light and dark, the division of the frame. This image is another one that kind of plays around with our sense of scale. So it was made by a Hungarian photographer named André Kertész, and it's the view from his window in Greenwich Village, New York City, looking south out to the World Trade Towers. But we have these birds that appear to be enormous. They look kind of like pterodactyls flying around the trade towers. And obviously, they are not. Kertész used a very long lens to get this image. So the trade towers were a few miles south of where he was, and had he used a short lens, a normal or wide-angle lens, they would have been pretty small in the frame. So he used this long lens in order to come in closer to the towers. And there are these birds, these seagulls flying around. The seagulls were much closer to his lens than the buildings, but they're all kind of far away from him, and so they appear to be in the same plane. So the longer the lens, the more of this effect you get, and that is a flattening of space, where it's difficult to tell really how much space there is from the area in the foreground to the area in the background. And so these birds look as if they are in the same plane as the trade towers, and it look enormous. And obviously that can't be. If you look closely at the trade towers, each of these little rectangles is a window that was pretty big. And so those birds would be invisible. They'd be tiny little specks if they were actually that close to the towers. But it gives this kind of amazing effect of, of skewing our sense of space and scale. Let me go through here. This image, these next three final images, are made again by the French photographer Cartier-Bresson, who made the image of the women in Kashmir in India. This is a portrait of the French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, winner of the Nobel Prize somewhat later. This image was made in 1947. And you can see that Cartier-Bresson used shallow depth of field. It's so shallow that the man in the foreground is also out of focus. And as we go back in the frame, it quickly falls out of focus. And again, Cartier-Bresson did this on purpose, consciously, to de-emphasize the background. So this line of perspective is really strong. We have these lamps and then the building in the background, and had they been in focus, they would very likely have competed with the subject, with Sartre, for dominance in the frame. And maybe we wouldn't really know where we're supposed to look. But by using shallow depth of field and keeping Sartre in focus and everything else out of focus, our eyes are directed to Sartre. It's not that our eyes don't move around in the frame. They do. We're led back, into the frame, kind of over this man's head, then back into the frame. But again, we don't like to look at things out of focus, so we return to our point of focus here. This is an image of Sartre's life partner, the writer and feminist writer Simone de Beauvoir, made in the same year. And in terms of the structure of the image, the composition, it's pretty similar in many ways to this last image. So the subject, again, is placed in the lower right-hand frame, is looking out to the left. There's this strong line of perspective going back in the frame, although in this case, from left to right instead of right to left. We even have a lamp post again. In this case, the frame is divided very nicely, both in terms of from left to right and from foreground to background. So the presence of these people are very important, not because of who they are. We have no idea who they are because they're out of focus. But in terms of the balance of the frame, they're important. Had this been empty street, it would have been this expanse of white that would have kind of pulled our eyes into and out of the frame and away from the subject. By having them here, the image is balanced both from left to right, right to left, and from foreground to background. But again, the depth of field is shallow, so our eyes are directed to the subject. One last image, again by Cartier-Bresson, showing great depth of field. So it's another portrait, but in this case, Cartier-Bresson chose to use great depth of field. This is a portrait of the French photographer Robert Doisneau, who is a good friend of Cartier-Bresson's, and who is known for his photographs made in the city of Paris and about Paris. And they used humor. They were kind of like pithy one-liners in some ways. There's fun, a lot of them. But anyway, they were about Paris. And Cartier-Bresson has placed his subject, Doisneau, on a rooftop in Paris. And you can see Paris, the rooftops of Paris, behind him and beyond. And Cartier-Bresson has used this railing, or whatever it is, as a sort of frame within a frame. Because had it not been there, everything would just have kind of faded back into the background. Because the depth of field is great. And so in terms of focus, the foreground gets equal weight with the background. And it's only this little frame within the frame that directs us back, allows our eyes to come back to the subject. Okay, so those are some examples. There are many, many, many other examples, but examples of great and shallow depth of field and how it is used in photographic images to direct our eyes, the viewer's eyes, into and around the frame and tell us where to look. Shallow depth of field makes it very easy because there's one area in focus and that's where we're supposed to look. Great depth of field relies on much more on composition to direct us into and around the frame, or to show a different relationship, maybe from the foreground to the background. So we use the depth of field, we manipulate it in order to create the effect that we want. visually in terms of what's in the frame, and also conceptually about the relationships in the frame. Relationships that may not actually be real, but are just created because we put things together in the frame. But how much is in focus will also determine how much of a relationship the viewers see, if that makes sense. Okay. So, any questions on depth of field? Anybody? All clear on depth of field? Yes? Okay, well, that is a good thing. Let me go to our, that's not right, our class Canvas page. And bring that up. So here's our page, and down at the bottom, in the course summary, pardon me, we have this first assignment. How did that go? Any comments or thoughts? All good? Everything good on this? Okay, well, we'll take a look at some of the images next time. But your second assignment is depth of field. And so here it is. And again, I give a description of what depth of field is, and then the assignment. And it says here, read this before you begin the assignment. Please do. And the assignment is to make 3 sets of images with 2 images in each set. And each set pertains to the thing that controls depth of field. So the first is aperture, the second focal length of the lens, and the third is the distance from subject. So for the first set, for aperture, I want you to change the aperture in order to change the depth of field. So you'll find a situation where hopefully you have space going back in the frame. So not just from here to here, or from my face to the wall, because that's about 1.5 feet behind, or 2 feet, and it's not really enough to show a big change in depth of field. So a classroom where there's space and also there are people going back in the frame, or outside in your yard where you have a couple of chairs and plants and whatever, so that when the depth of field changes, you can see that it changes. So I want you to find a situation and then choose a point of focus. So let's say you have your dog sleeping on on the ground in the middle of your yard. So for the first image, you'll be showing great depth of field. So use a small aperture, and you'll decide on a focal length of the lens, and you'll decide on a certain distance from the subject, and you'll stay there. And so for the first image, you'll use, did I say small? Great depth of field, you'll use a small aperture. And then you'll change the aperture from very small to very large. Use the extremes of your lens. So open it up all the way to the widest aperture. When you do that, you of course will have to change the shutter speed. And don't move. Keep your focal length of the lens the same. Keep your point of focus the same, your dog or whatever it is. And then make this image, which will show shallow depth of field. In the second set, the thing that you'll change to change the depth of field will be the focal length of the lens. Now, when you do that, your framing will change because the angle of view changes. But you will decide on this will be a different situation than the first one. So you'll find 3 different situations. So you will, again, decide on a point of focus, a subject. You will decide on a certain distance from the subject. You'll decide on a certain aperture, f-stop, so maybe f8. And then what you'll change is the focal length of the lens. So most of you have zoom lenses. For great depth of field, you'll use the shortest portion of the lens, the widest angle. And then for shallow depth of field, you'll extend it out to the longest portion of the lens, the most telephoto, and make 2 images there. Again, keeping the point of focus the same, your distance from the subject the same, and in this case, the aperture the same. In the third set, the thing that you'll be changing is the distance from the subject. So you will decide on an aperture, maybe f8, decide on a focal length of the lens, maybe 50 millimeters or whatever you decide on. Probably somewhere in the middle is best. And what you'll change is the actual distance from subject. So for great depth of field, you'll be further away. And for shallow depth of field, you'll come in close. With all of these, use the extremes. Don't just change the f-stop from f5.6 to f8 or f8 to f11. The difference in the depth of field will be so subtle you won't really see it. With the focal lengths of the lens, the extremes, the widest angle and the most telephoto. The subject, distance from subject, come in very close and then back up maybe 5 or 10 feet. Okay. Do not use the flash. Do not use the auto or program modes. Use probably what will work best for you is using the aperture priority mode, which allows you to control the aperture, and then the camera will automatically set the appropriate shutter speeds. Okay. I don't know why that was left off, but for submission, I want you to change the name of each image to reflect what it's showing. So for aperture, you'll say f2 and then f22. For focal length of the lens, you'll say 24 millimeters and then 150 millimeters. For the distance from subject, you'll say 1 foot and then 10 feet or 8 feet. Okay. Normally, I would have you submit these in folders, but Canvas doesn't accept folders. It only accepts individual images, which I know is a pain in the neck. One thing that you can do, instead of submitting them one at a time on Canvas, is to zip all of them and then submit the zip folder or file. And then I can open it and unzip it on my computer. Okay. So any questions on depth of field? All good? All good on depth of field? This is tentatively due next Monday. Again, I know that we all have changed lives. So if you can't get it in Monday, do get it in sooner rather than later. But I will not penalize you for late assignments, but I do want to see them so that we can go over them, and I can make comments, and at least comments in Canvas, and hopefully look at some of them as we talk as well. Okay. So I've been going on for almost an hour and a half, and so next time we will also devote much more of our session to Lightroom. Okay. In the meantime, there are videos posted to be watched on Lightroom, and I hope that you are going into Lightroom and loading your images and looking at them and organizing them, and next time we will start with more, how should I say, determination maybe, and working on your images in Lightroom. And so I will post, I started doing it and then it used so much bandwidth I couldn't do it. I will load a whole, a bunch of images that we can work on together in Lightroom. Okay. Okay, well, if there are no questions or anything, do I hear something?
Are you going to have what you did like last Wednesday, like talk
An
to
office hour. Yes.
An office hour. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I will email you guys. I need to move it up an hour. So instead of 12:30 to 2:30, it'll be 11:30 to 1:30 to take my mother to the doctor. But yes, I will have 2 hours of office hours on Wednesday. So we'll have the open Zoom, and you can come in and out as you like.
Okay, and you'll send us the link?
I will indeed. I think the one I sent you is is ongoing, but I'll send it again anyway, and I will post it on Canvas so that you have access to that. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I haven't submitted my first one in, and I'll do it in the next couple days. It's just been a little hectic.
Yep. Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, have a delightful week and weekend. Please photograph, stay safe and healthy. And
Thank you. You too.
take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.